Greetings and welcome. We're doing our discussion of Justin Gest's book, The New White Minority, as a way of trying to understand the support for right-wing populism in the United States. So let's begin with some of the background assumptions with which Gest makes and lots of other people make in order to explain the rise of conservative thinking, right-wing thinking, populist thinking in the United States and in other countries. It is often believed that economic conditions have a great deal of influence on people's political behavior, and that in particular, economic stagnation or depression, chronic unemployment, and lack of opportunities for social mobility breed anti-democratic politics. Claims like these are very familiar as explanations in the 1930s of the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany or the Fascist Party in Italy during those decades. The Great Depression all around the world had created vast economic stagnation, unemployment, lack of economic growth, and recession of economic productivity all around the world. In Germany and countries associated with Germany, the loss in World War I and the reparations which were demanded by the peace settlement by the Allies made Germany's economy precarious in the 1920s and 30s. And so one question that we are forced to ask is we ask the question, how do democracy and the politics of hate and division, how do these things fit together? We're forced to ask the question, does economic stagnation and precarity lead working class people to embrace right-wing, authoritarian, populist leaders? And the answer to that question is not inevitable. One might as easily argue that economic stagnation and precarious economic circumstances might be thought to lead working class people to embrace progressive, left-wing populist leaders, might lead them to turn out in very large numbers for a Bernie Sanders kind of candidate. So the question is a hard one. Does economic stagnation, economic trouble lead working class people to embrace right-wing authoritarianism? In the 1950s, we've seen from McAdam and Cluse, in the 1950s, the United States was a reasonably unified country when it came to politics. There was a reasonable level of prosperity, in fact, a pretty amazing level of prosperity following World War II. There were lots of job opportunities for high school graduates. People, men and women, with a high school diploma could get a decent job in an industrial setting and could have a middle-class life. And furthermore, the gains of economic growth during those decades, the late 40s, the 50s, into the 60s, the gains of economic growth were widely shared across income groups. The graph, which I've got here, takes a little bit of study in order to understand it, because it is a graph of income, the gains going to three different groups: the lowest 20th percentile, the median of income, and the 95th percentile of income, compared to the income levels for those three groups in 1973. So 1973 is the 0 point. But what you see looking backward is that each of those groups from about 1948 on the graph through about 1975 or so, 1980, each of those groups grew their incomes at about the same rate. And you could interpret that as meaning that prosperity was shared very evenly across all segments of the American public. But then after 1980, you see the graphs begin to diverge. The median continues to rise a bit. The 20th percentile is essentially flat, and the 95th percentile rises dramatically. In other words, from 1980 onward, the US economy showed ever increasing levels of inequality between the very rich, the pretty rich, the middle class, and lower income groups. That set of curves separated very sharply from 1980 to the present. This also meant that there was less social mobility. And the studies of social mobility, which are now available, very precise studies of social mobility, asking the question, for the cohort of young people born in, let's say, 1930, where did they wind up relative to the income group of their parents in 1950 or 1960, and likewise for the cohort groups moving forward, social mobility in the United States and also in the United Kingdom is very limited. The probability that a young person will move from the lowest quintile to the second lowest quintile, from the bottom 20% to between 20 and 40 percentile of income, the probability is pretty low. So in other words, the quintile of income that you're born into in your family pretty well predicts what level of income you will have as an adult. In the 1950s, there were opportunities for mobility. There was low unemployment. It was pretty easy for most people to get a job and to get a decent job. It also has to be underlined, though, that issues of racial inequality were present in the whole country. In the South, the Jim Crow system was continuing to dominate relations between white and black Southerners. But segregation in the North and unequal opportunities in the North were very present as well in the 1950s and 60s. So the situation of income, social mobility, educational opportunities for young black people were very different from those opportunities for young white people. The situation in the 1990s had changed dramatically. The whole economy had become more globalized. And what does that mean, really? It means that there was more international trade. The mantra was globalization, international trade, moving production to the countries where it can be done most efficiently, gaining the advantages of trade across many countries. And the idea was, and there's a lot of economic reasoning and empirical experience to suggest that this is true, that reasonably open borders across countries lead to a more efficient global economy. There was a very rapid increase in the internationalization of trade from the 1970s through the present. One of the consequences of that is that in the US economy from the 1980s forward, there was a rapid offshoring of manufacturing, where companies which had done their manufacturing in the North or possibly in the South or in the Southwest had found that there were more cost-effective ways of doing manufacturing in Mexico, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, in China, and in Korea. So offshoring of manufacturing led to a decline in manufacturing employment in the United States. The graph that I've provided to you on the right here is also one that you have to really kind of study in order to understand it, but it is the proportion of basically industrial production to the total of gross domestic product. And what it shows from about 1980 to the present is a gradual, well, not even gradually, a fairly rapidly declining, though kind of erratic performance, declining share or relationship between total industrial production and the total size of the American economy. Over that period of time, there was a substantial decrease in the total percentage of the US economy generated by onshore industrial and manufacturing activity. This meant, in particular, that there was a real decline in demand for industrial jobs, unionized jobs, jobs in heavy industry, including steel, aluminum, materials processing, and cars. So the car economy, the automobile economy, was a very major part of the US economy, and a part that our part of the world, the industrial Midwest, benefited very greatly from. But a great deal of production was moved offshore in all of those industries, including both steel and also autos. That meant that there was increasing competition for high-paid, low-skill, low-education jobs in manufacturing, but that pushed competition down into the low-skill markets as well. This, in turn, created a situation of dwindling expectations from 1980 forward, dwindling expectations for blue-collar workers, for low-skilled industrial workers and also service workers, dwindling expectations for their own incomes, for their retirement security, for their material well-being during their years of employment, and perhaps most importantly, for the prospects of their children. That world important change, that change which was occurring throughout the whole world, is crucially important to the story that Justin Gest is telling us about the emergence of the new white minority. So how can we understand that last graph, that process which developed in American industry and so fundamentally changed the geography, especially of the industrial Midwest? It was described as a process of deindustrialization at the macro level, but we could also call it a process of demoralization at the individual level. Just underlines the point that there historically has been relatively limited social mobility both in the US and Great Britain. That's a paradoxical thing for many of us because we think of the US as a land of opportunity, but actually the statistics are rather poor for social mobility in the United States and even worse in Great Britain. But the emergence of Rust Belt cities where a lot of manufacturing had departed, where there were empty factories, where there was suddenly much less employment in heavy industry, the emergence of Rust Belt cities was a sudden new circumstance from the 1960s and 70s onward. And these cities showed patterns of unemployment, education levels which were declining, emerging health disparities, and other indicators of social despair. Here's a quote from Gest, which I think captures a lot of his thinking. Many of Youngstown's citizens occupied the space between poverty and middle-class stability, a precarious place that incentivizes families to balance their pursuit of a living wage with their maintenance of government assistance. The city's per capita income is $14,996, while the average household earns $24,800 per year. Those are strikingly low numbers for family income. Youngstown leads the country in concentrated poverty, with 33.8% of its households living beneath the poverty line of the United States. These are striking numbers. And why did that occur? Well, it occurred because heavy industry disappeared from Youngstown in a period of about 10 to 15 years. So let's take a look at Michigan, because almost all of us are from Michigan, or we at least have lived in Michigan for a long time. Richard Florida is an observer of cities whose work I have admired for a long time. And he did an article in Bloomberg publication, which I've now distributed to you and have asked you to read. But his analysis of the class composition of Detroit metropolitan region is very, very interesting to me, and I think you'll find it interesting as well. One thing that he notes is over the period from, let's say, 1980 to the present, the shrinking middle of blue-collar workers. Michigan had been a state in which blue-collar workers were kind of the anchor of the middle class. Richard Florida also identifies Michigan as forward moving in the sense that there is a rising population of what he refers to as the creative class, the ranks of knowledge workers, professional workers, and the creative class. It's very interesting that because of the auto industry, there are more PhDs per capita in some parts of Michigan than in Silicon Valley. This is a region of very advanced technical expertise, but it is also a region of shrinking numbers of high-pay, blue-collar industrial work. And then finally, the third group that he identifies is the even larger, faster-growing ranks of low-paid service workers. Now, when you look at the maps, which he includes in this article, they're very interesting. If you look at the maps and try to figure out where your own home community is, what you'll see is in the map on the far left, that's the whole Detroit metropolitan region, and the three colors represent what he refers to as the creative class, that's the blue, the service class, that's the red, and then the pale blue is the working class. And what he identifies is that there's a real stratification, real separation of our Detroit metro region into communities which are predominantly populated with high income, creative class families, lower income, blue collar and working class families, and even lower income service workers. On the far right, you see a map of the racial composition of our region. And it is a very striking map, but what it color codes census districts according to whether they are 80% or more of one racial group. And so the red blocks are 80% or more African American individuals. The dark blue are 80% or more white individuals, and the pale gray are mixed with no population being 80% or more. But what you see is extreme segregation in our region, and the segregation of our state is also significant. The middle map is also interesting because it gives you a more fine-grained view of Detroit and the suburbs immediately surrounding Detroit. It is quite interesting that one of the most important social changes since World War II is the sudden population shift from city centers to suburban cities, to belt cities around city centers. And part of that shift has to do with white flight, beginning in the 1950s. Part of it has to do with federal housing policy, with the creation of new roads that made it easier to travel from Livonia to your place of work, if you had a place of work in the city of Detroit. But the upshot is that segregation by race of communities remained a very important economic and social factor in the state of Michigan and in southeast Michigan. I reproduced from his article two lists of the districts which have the highest percentage of service workers on the right and highest percentage of working class workers on the left. And if you inspect the list, I think you'll find a number of interesting things. Dearborn is on the left with 47% of individuals being of the working class, which is interesting. Dearborn is an older suburban city, directly adjacent, of course, as we all know, to Detroit, home of Ford Motor Company, and 47% of the residents of Dearborn are classified as working class. One more map, which I found interesting for our purposes, because remember, what we're interested in kind of focusing in on here is to what extent are economic circumstances and economic opportunity relevant to the formation of political behavior and political attitudes. And what I've got here is the distribution of income across the state of Michigan. And what you see is that the highest income districts in Michigan are in southeast Michigan, in other words, in our region. And the footnote, it's not really a footnote, but the end of the passage on the left is really important. Central cities such as Detroit, Flint, and Lansing do not appear visually prominent on this map, but they are important holes in the distribution. And what that means is that those largely African American cities are low income in a sea of higher income districts. So I think this map also is kind of interesting. Towards the end, we're going to be asking ourselves the question, why is the state of Michigan such a home for right-wing militia activity? And we can at least entertain the question that the poverty and the situation of rural life in the upper half of the state of Michigan, that maybe that's a fortuitous situation in terms of encouraging right-wing engagement in extremist organizations. But here's another important change, post-war change, which Gest takes to be very important, and that is the feature of demographic change. In Great Britain, it was an influx of people of color, Muslim people, people from South Asia, Southeast Asia, in large numbers, so that neighborhoods were fairly quickly transformed from being 90% white to being mixed in much more of a balanced percentage between different national communities. In the US, the competition was largely between white communities and then African American communities and Latino communities. But the question is there a competition for getting access to the middle class among these national groups, these ethnic groups, these racial groups? Is there competition across ethnic and racial groups for access to middle class status? And Gest's view is that the white working class had previously essentially had exclusive access to the jobs which were necessary for membership in what we in America anyway call the middle class, but that that access has declined dramatically during the period from 1970 to the present. Here's a quote which I think is worthwhile paying attention to because it kind of captures the demographic shift which occurred in Youngstown and many other communities in the United States. Quoting, "Whether white people's working class status is defined according to education, occupation, or income-based standards, a 30 to 50% decline in the relative size of this group from the World War II era to today in the United States has transpired." A vast reduction in the composition of the white working class. And recent research, I'm continuing the quote, recent research suggests that these trends may be intensified by an extraordinary 22% rise in the mortality rate of white working class people since 1999, which has taken place in an era during which death rates among all other groups decline. That's also a startling statistic. So a couple of ideas which Gest introduces. He introduces the idea of what he calls a post-traumatic city. And this is really a key to his analysis. He thinks of white working class in terms of urban populations. We're pretty familiar with what he's referring to as a post-traumatic city as a Rust Belt city. The Rust Belt cities are those cities in the United States, cities which had been the place during World War II where manufacturing of military equipment, tanks and guns and aircraft and bombers and so forth, Willow Run, massive manufacturing and industrial facilities. These cities in the Midwest were massive industrial enterprises. And after World War II, there was a decline which accelerated from the 1970s onward. And so the relatively sudden loss of manufacturing firms, the offshoring of manufacturing, the moving of factories from inner cities to more distant locations, then moving factories to the south, then eventually moving factories to other countries. What this led to in cities like Cleveland and Youngstown and other cities around the Midwest, Milwaukee, this led to rapid, extensive loss of manufacturing industry and jobs and subsequent loss of middle-class opportunities. And the cities which Gest highlights include some cities very familiar to all of us and familiar from recent news. Erie, Pennsylvania, Flint, Michigan, Gary, Indiana, Kenosha, Wisconsin, Michigan City, Toledo, Ohio, and Youngstown, Ohio. These are all what he calls post-traumatic cities. We could call them Rust Belt cities. And certainly Detroit could be and should be included in this list. The loss of manufacturing in the city of Detroit and then loss of manufacturing in Detroit Metro has been very substantial since the 1980s and 90s. So what is the Rust Belt? Well, take a look at this map. It's a very, very interesting economic geography. And it is and has been the heart of auto manufacturing, but also steel manufacturing, auto suppliers, and auto manufacturing directly constituted a large percentage of the economic output of this region. But much of that manufacturing activity has declined, has moved elsewhere to non-union parts of the United States in the South. So manufacturing Ford autos or General Motors autos in the Carolinas, but also offshoring of, it may be whole vehicle assembly or it may be parts assembly to Mexico and to Canada, has led to a dramatic decrease in the total amount of industrial workforce in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and so forth. These are cities which have often experienced high unemployment and substantial underemployment, and also high levels of racial segregation. And underemployment means precarity. It means maybe temporary employment. It means part-time jobs. In today's market, it might mean being an Uber driver or a Lyft driver for a period of time. And it also means going from a union wage of, let's say, $26 an hour to a minimum wage job of $9.50 an hour. So reduced hours and reduced pay led to dramatically different economic well-being for families who were affected by this dramatic economic change, which afflicted all across the Rust Belt. Quoting concerning the emergence of these post-traumatic cities, there, Youngstown and East London he's referring to, and elsewhere, the white working class populations I consider are consumed by a nostalgia that expresses bitter resentment towards the big companies that abandoned their city, a government that did little to stop them from leaving, and a growing share of visible minorities who are altering their neighborhood's complexion. Now, if you think about that, what he's describing here is three sources of resentment. The corporations, which pulled out of Flint, Michigan, for example, when General Motors pulled out of Flint, Michigan, or when American Motors pulled out of Kenosha, Wisconsin. So the corporations, which abandoned the cities which had come to depend on their employment for a substantial portion of the workforce. But secondly, a government that did little to stop them from leaving. Well, it's not that easy to see how government can stop companies from closing factories. And then a third source of resentment, which actually is hard to justify, but it's the idea that there are now visible minorities who are altering their neighborhood's complexion and, by implication anyway, taking the jobs which are currently available, taking even lower income jobs, making it harder to compete for a living in these changed circumstances. So what he's really describing here is the economic change which came along with globalization and deindustrialization of big cities like Cleveland and Detroit, and then the political psychology of resentment, which was, according to Gest, which was the result for working class populations. And of course, a crucial part of his statement is that a big piece of that resentment had to do with race and ethnicity, that other groups were competing for the economic opportunities which existed, and the frictions which can exist in a neighborhood were exacerbated. Here are some statistics that I found interesting in the Gest chapters that I asked you to read. 36% of Americans are white people without college degree in non-salaried jobs. In other words, blue-collar jobs, working for, let's say, a General Motors plant. 36% of Americans are white people, no college degree, in non-salaried jobs. A salaried job would be an engineer or a white-collar job. 33% of American families are white households earning less than $60,000 per year. 43% of Americans are white people without professional or managerial jobs, and 48% of Americans are white people without a 4-year college degree. What he's trying to identify here is who are the people who have been most disadvantaged, and in particular, who are the white people who have been most disadvantaged by the very rapid economic transformations which have happened for low education, low skill jobs in the United States. The sudden disappearance of unionized, high income, high wage, high hourly rate jobs which could support a middle class lifestyle for the people of Michigan and Ohio. What's the size of that white American population which is dependent on those jobs? And these figures from 36 to 48% are the group that he's talking about. Another important concept which he introduces is the concept of political marginality. And I know that you have probably formed an idea of what political marginality is, but it's the idea that a group has its own collective identity. It has a way of thinking about itself. So white working class people, you could probably think of some movies which maybe capture this. The Good Will Hunting kind of comes to my mind as a movie which captures this. South Boston, young men and women, but their collective identity. Who are we? We're young white guys who work for hourly jobs, and we have an identity together. And so that's the collective identity side of it. But then furthermore, there's the idea that the group has formed, that it has been left behind, that this group has been unfairly treated, and maybe is on a track to have continuing economic and social decline. So that creates a sense of social marginality and political marginality. Gest believes that groups experiencing political marginality are likely to engage in politics of either rebellion, and rebellion can take several forms, or withdrawal. And in either case, they are open to recruitment in populist social movements. So he's offering kind of a theory of political sociology, political motivation, that people who have been politically marginalized in this way. And the interviews, which in the end I did not ask you to read from the Gest book, but it would be wonderful if you, on your own initiative, read the chapter on Youngstown. But the interviews are very poignant because there's a lot of hopelessness in these interviews, and the idea that the politicians can't help us, the companies have completely betrayed us, the elite people who are running our town don't care about us at all. In fact, they're contemptuous of us. There's no place to turn. We are politically marginalized. So it's worth thinking a little bit about how Gest does his work. He is a sociologist and he's an ethnographer. An ethnographer is a person who does face-to-face social research, anthropological research, and he has done his research in addition to background, kind of demographic sociological research. But the heart of his work is his own immersion in the communities of these two places, of Youngstown, Ohio, and East London. And he does gathering of knowledge and information through in-depth, unstructured interviews with over 100 people in each location to understand their daily lives and their political culture. What is their life experience? What are their political motivations? What do they care about? What are they aggravated about? Quoting from Gest, white working class people sense that they have been demoted from the center of their country's consciousness to its fringe, and many feel powerless in their attempts to do something about it. So you have a sense of the powerlessness which is emerging from the people he talked to in Youngstown. Where do they turn? Let's say a word or two about the racial politics. These white, now partially employed, lower income, suddenly displaced white men and women in Youngstown. How does race come into this? Well, here are two quotes I wanted to share with you. Rather, the individuals I surveyed and interviewed as part of my ethnographic fieldwork believe ethnic minorities have been given social advantages at the expense of white working class people. My respondents perceive a society that they acknowledge once rendered white people an inherent advantage, but now overcompensates for these missteps. In short, many white working class people feel like the victims of discrimination. So that's one observation which he has from his conversations with young, well, not always young, but white men and women in these two communities. The second quote, white working class people are consumed by their loss of social and political status in social hierarchies, particularly in relation to immigrant and minority reference groups. Their politics are motivated and pervaded by a nostalgia that reveres and seeks to reinstate a bygone era. And this is almost kind of unrelated to, maybe it's parallel to, but it's unrelated to the economic decline which the white working class has experienced, but it's a decline in status and identity. So I wanted to bring us up to this week, and that is the presidential election, but also to the state of Michigan, and to ask the question, how do Gest's ideas play out in terms of how what we know about the way in which the American electorate is breaking out in terms of its support for the two presidential candidates, the party of the right and Donald Trump, and the party of the, quote, left or the progressive party or the Democrat Party, Joe Biden. And this Pew Public Opinion Survey, which was done at the beginning of October, so just about a month ago, so it's pretty up to date, is actually very illuminating when we compare its results with some of the background thinking that we've already reviewed from Gest. And we can ask the question, how does the political behavior of the United States conform to Gest's hypotheses about what drives political motivation? And there are a couple of things which I suggest you blow this graph up and then think about it. But there are a couple of things which I wanted to draw your attention to. First of all, there are very large, very important racial disparities which are indicated here. And in fact, a majority of white voters prefer Trump, not by a very large margin, but a margin. The majority of white voters prefer Trump. A large majority of Black, Hispanic, and Asian voters prefer Biden. That's interesting. So out of white voters, slightly more white voters prefer Trump to Biden. Out of Black, Hispanic, and Asian voters, a vast majority of those voters prefer Biden. I think I misspoke a minute ago, but you understand what I was saying. Secondly, there are large educational disparities. And in fact, just as we might expect from Gest's analysis, a slight majority, not a big majority, but a slight majority of no college Americans prefer Trump. And there is a larger advantage to Trump among whites with no college degree. In fact, it's a quite striking advantage. It's 60% of white citizens, no college degree. 60% of them prefer Trump to only 34% who prefer Biden. And this last data point does seem to be the white working class demographic group which Gest is trying to discuss and understand. And yet I'm not ready to say Gest has got it right. He's kind of diagnosed why populist politics, right-wing politics, anti-democratic politics are coming to the fore. And that's for a couple reasons. First of all, available evidence that I've reviewed anyway seems to indicate that support for right-wing extremism, the white supremacy groups, armed militia groups, potentially violent anti-government groups, these groups seem to be most virulent among rural populations. The Timothy McVeighs of this world, or the Bundy brothers in Utah and then Oregon. These are rural extremists, not urban extremists. It is, for me, an interesting question for research whether extremist right-wing organizations can succeed in recruiting followers and adherents in Warren, Wixom, or Dearborn, which, as we saw a little earlier, are all cities with high proportions of blue-collar workers. In other words, Gest seems to be saying that right-wing populism is favored in Rust Belt cities, but and I guess I'm persuaded by the Pew study that shows us that that particular demographic, white voters, no college, that demographic is voting strongly in favor of Trump. So that is support for a right-wing political movement. But the extremism that we've discussed so often in this course, I'm still not persuaded that that form of extremism is supported by blue-collar workers from Wixom. My impression, in other words, is negative, but I have to concede that that's not based on any kind of empirical study, and it would be very interesting to examine the locations and occupations of the men who have been recently charged with conspiracy to kidnap the governor. They're undoubtedly right-wing extremists and potentially violent right-wing extremists. And so the question of where they're from, what class they come from, is an interesting question when we consider the Gest line of thought. Are they disaffected white working class men, or is there something more complicated going on? So just to draw together this short presentation about Justin Gest's new white minority. There is a consistent story here which Gest is telling, and I think it's an interesting and important one. I do want to pose for you the question, how does it fit with our experience of life in Michigan? Does it support the idea that support for right-wing populism should line up with out-of-work factory workers? Does right-wing populism appeal to out-of-work does right-wing populism appeal to out-of-work factory workers? And I don't know the answer to that, so it's a question for research. Is right-wing extremism in our state more typical of the northern part of the state, the more rural part of the state, than it is of the southern part of the state? And it is, of course, very interesting to be living through the experiment today, because this is an interesting question to consider as the election unfolds during the week. And it would be very interesting to look at the maps of voter turnout and support for various candidates and parties. Thanks. This went on longer than I expected, but it's all good stuff.